When I talk in classes and we do training for local governments in 2010 for LUCA, one of the questions was always, well, what's so confidential about addresses? You can go out on the street and find addresses. You can go into phone books. You can go find addresses any number of places. When it's in the Census Bureau's hands, it's no longer public. And every piece of information that is provided in LUCA is covered under Title 13. Title 13 simply requires that the Census Bureau protect confidential data, and that includes addresses. Yes, we all know that 123 Main Street is there, but if the Census Bureau tells you that 123 Main Street is there, you can't tell anybody else that you learned it from the census. It requires everybody who touches this information to abide by their confidentiality and security guidelines. That means anyone, if you're using paper products, anybody who has access to those paper products and lists. If you're on a computer network, anybody that has access to that network has to sign off on the confidentiality and security guidelines. In New York in 2010, we performed a statewide review in our office, and we simply solved that by having a couple of dedicated computers that were not connected to our agency network, so that the only people that had access to them were those who were directly involved with the review process. Those computers were in a separate room, which was lockable. So you need to protect access to your systems, access to your computers, and access to all of the Title 13 data. Census Bureau it's zero tolerance. There's no margin for maybe having it secure and maybe not having it secure. You have to agree to this. And for the Census Bureau, they're subject to, $250,000 fine and 5 years in prison. So you don't want to mess with that. Protect the data. So you have to meet all of those security requirements, and I'm pretty much reiterating what was on the earlier slide. Make sure that you can agree to those requirements. What's new for 2020? Streamlined participation. They're trying to make it a little easier for you in terms of selecting the type of data that you will receive from the Census Bureau, the address data, digital formats that are easier to work with in standard spreadsheet software, latitude and longitude. GIS, even since 2010, has exploded and been available to many more local governments, particularly at the county level. And so those coordinate points for addresses are now available to you. What we're talking about here is residential address information, and if the Census Bureau doesn't have it and you do, that is documentation of the existence of an address, and you are able to submit that information. One of the real sticky points here in the LUCA process in addressing is multi-unit structures, and you need to be very clear that multi-unit structures, it's not, what you want is not just the address for the building. Each of those individual units within it has to be identified. Apartment 1, 2, first floor, second floor, basement, attic. However you can identify those units, it needs to be part of your LUCA submission. And the Census Bureau allows you to identify those substructure units. I'm gonna pause right now and ask the operator to come on and allow an opportunity for questions and unmute your lines in case anybody has questions.
Hi, my name is Kelly. I'm from the city of Caliente, a tiny little place in Nevada. Please be real patient with me. This is completely new to me. I am a little concerned as to how the process works when the mail system, USPS, only delivers with a P.O. box in our community. Okay.
I will speak from the experience that I've had in prior censuses, because we have a lot of communities in New York that are the same way. I live in one. A lot of people get their mail at the post office and do not have house-to-house delivery. it's necessary for the Census Bureau to reconcile that post office box delivery with the actual physical location of the unit. So in the case of LUCA, this just occurred to me, this might be an opportunity. If you have an XY coordinate for the physical location of that unit that can be tied to the LUCA submission, that would be advantageous. In the materials, I think I've got a slide coming up in the example of paper materials where you can identify the type of address, whether it's a location address, a mailing address, or both. And in the case of those post office boxes, you would want to identify that. But you raise an important consideration for a lot of rural, small areas.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. So tools that are available. One of the difficult things about LUCA is that it is not easy. It does take resources, but there are some things that you can do to help out in that process and try and make it as efficient as possible. One of them is this early address count list. This is available to you right now. It has been for some months. What the Census Bureau prepares, and we started this in New York some years ago, because New York provided the Census Bureau with substantial upgrade to our geography. And one of the things that we asked to have come back was a count of master address file addresses at the block level. That's now available for everybody. So you can go on to the Bureau's website and download the count file and use that to do some targeting. They have an updated geocoding tool. Again, you can do that online at the Census Bureau. If you have significant GIS capability already, you probably don't need this. But for those smaller, medium-sized places, the Census Bureau's geocoding tool can be quite beneficial because, again, it's that physical location of the address that is critical. It has to be placed in a census block. Everybody has to have a census block. The GUPS software, Geographic Update Partnership software, the Census Bureau has developed this tool for people who don't have GIS, but it's essentially a GIS-type interface. We're hoping that the LUCA component of GUPS becomes available soon because it's necessary to do some training on that, but it is another tool that will be available to you. You also have a number of options for participation. GUPS is, as I mentioned, a software application. You do not need GIS, and it includes all of your address and geographic mapping base for conducting the LUCA program. You can get data in digital forms that is basically readable in pretty much any spreadsheet database software, generic files that can be imported for analysis on the computer. And for smaller local governments, you can still do paper listing and paper maps, and we'll talk about those. Schedule, we're pretty well on here, and it's coming down to the wire. Again, participation, December 15th is the deadline. If you don't get that highest elected official signing the lettering to the Census Bureau by the 15th, you will not participate in LUCA, no exceptions. The actual address review period is 120 days, beginning when you receive the data in February. So whenever your 120 days puts you in April, that will conclude the LUCA, your review opportunity. And again, 120 days is a hard deadline. You need to get it submitted within that period. Census Bureau gets an awful lot of data that they have to process and try and understand, and they will deliver feedback to you in that late 2019 period. And there will be an appeal process. The structure of that and guidelines, I'm sure, will be a Federal Register notice in the future. To my knowledge, it has not been finalized yet. So what do you need to do now? Get your highest elected officials to register. You're on a training workshop. There are a number of them that have been recorded, and as Jennifer mentioned earlier, another one coming up in January. Keep up with those. Most important right now, it comes down to your local address data. What information at a state, county, or local level do you have that has address information that can be used to verify the master address file, add to it, or correct it? One of the purposes of doing this now is to target your efforts. You will be able to go into the master address file, and there will be blocks where Census has done a marvelous job, and you don't really need to worry about them. There will be blocks where you can identify more addresses than the Census Bureau has, and there will be blocks where you identify fewer addresses than the Census Bureau has. That knowledge is how you prioritize your work. 120 days goes pretty fast. If you have a prioritization of those most significant block errors that you need to resolve, now is the time to do that so that you can maximize your 120 days. People really only live in two types of living quarters. There's only two classifications. You're either in a household or group quarters. These are, pretty easy to understand in general. Households where people live, independent house, apartment, mobile home, all of these typical types of living quarters that we think of. But there are unusual ones too. What if you're on a river and somebody lives in a houseboat? What if somebody has sold their home and they live in an RV? They can be living quarters and need to be identified. So households can be occupied or vacant. You need to identify both. The Census Bureau needs to get a questionnaire to all types of dwelling units. Let them worry about whether at census time it's occupied or vacant, but they need to have the address. And, residential housing units come in any variety of forms. You look at this unit here, typical duplex kind of unit with two entries. Well, maybe when it was constructed, but what if these doorways now are entry to two apartments, a first-floor apartment and a second-floor apartment? The interior has been converted. Do they have two addresses? So even what you think of as typical residential housing isn't always typical. In Albany here we have a lot of cases around the State University where, these larger old homes have been subdivided for student housing. And I teach students, and some of them will tell me, they get their mail together. There's one mailbox, and then they parcel out the mail to the individuals. Census Bureau needs to know that there are multiple units there. So you need to think about how units get added to your housing stock. New construction is a pretty obvious one. And local governments, most local governments in the country, have a permitting process before you build, certificates of occupancy. Those units end up getting addressed. The Postal Service picks them up. Emergency management picks them up, and those should be captured. There will be a new construction program post-LUCA where you can additionally identify addresses, because what you're identifying now is up through 2017. What about new construction in 2018 and 19? Those units will have to be included. Lots of different types of conversion. Residential house that's converted into multiple units. Non-residential lofts, warehouses that have been converted into residential units. Units that have been rehabbed and converted and are now put back into use. Mobile homes come and go. Rural areas, there are a lot of areas around here where there's cut up through the trees, and you don't know whether there's a mobile home up there or a mansion or what. All of those things need to be identified. And the converse is also true. Units disappear. Units get demolished. The residential unit gets converted to non-residential. Units get abandoned. The mobile homes get relocated. It's a dynamic process. That's one of the things that makes it somewhat difficult, because you have to keep a handle on that. There are some typical sources. There are some typical sources that are used for identification, and this gives you a pretty good list of them. Property tax assessment is probably one of the most frequently used. emergency management. You keep track of new construction and a whole variety of other address-based files. But the thing to keep in mind is these administrative records, every administrative record is designed for an administrative purpose. It is not necessarily designed to identify all living quarters, and so it's those unusual anomalies that are difficult to find. And this last bullet here becomes important. Sometimes you simply just have to go out into the field and look at what is going on to try and understand the housing situation. There are lots of different types of problem areas: new developments, apartment complexes, illegal and unconventional types of units. There are lots of ways in which housing becomes problematic, and you have to be creative. The easy stuff is just that. That's usually not what you have to focus on. It's the hard, hidden type of units that become a real problem in the LUCA program, those single-address units that have been converted into multiple units, non-residential conversions, and the need to have individual addresses that are ultimately geocoded to a block. That block boundary, that block identifier is critical in the LUCA process. Some of you may know Joe Salvo in the New York City Planning Department. Joe Salvo and his colleague Peter Lobo and their staff, they really cut initial ground in LUCA in the 2000 census. New York City always maintained that they were undercounted by 750,000 people, but there was never any data. When the LUCA program came around in 2000, they did their research. They did their field research. And, this example of 4 mailboxes, well, if you look closely here, you'll see that there are lots of different surnames on each of these mailboxes. Do those represent one unit with multiple people of different surnames living together, or do they actually represent multiple units? It's obviously hard to tell. Here's a unit that the Census Bureau had one address. Everybody got their mail at one address. But clearly there are 5 mailboxes. If you look closely, there are 5 doorbells. There are 5 units in here. Census had one address. This one seems pretty identifiable. Well, there's a mail slot down here in a basement apartment, clearly a renovated basement apartment. Does everybody get their mail here at the main mailbox and then the residents parcel it out and deliver it here? These are the difficult ones, and sometimes it's only field research that will identify these types of units. And another problem which goes to the geocoding issue is streets are named oddly. There are lots of different names to identify the same street. My address is 306 County Route 6. I see it often as CTY Route 6, or County Road 6, or CR 6, or Schufelt Road. All of those represent the same address, the same location. So when you geocode addresses, simply knowing that these aliases are important to identify an address is critical. This is where sometimes there's confusion that the computer process can just spit out, all of the addresses that match properly and spit out the ones that don't. Well, all of those ones that it spits out that don't match may simply be naming conventions, and you have to pay attention to that. Group quarters is another completely different residential living situation. College dormitories, prisons, nursing homes, those are all pretty self-explanatory, except that, think of senior communities that have been developed. It isn't just the nursing home that people move into. People may sell their house and they move into an apartment in a senior community. It's a household. They're independent. They come and go as they please. They have their own kitchen and everything. It's an independent unit. But in that same community, as they get older and more frail, they can move into another unit that has some levels of distance, and all the way to nursing care where they have total care. The identification of those units is critical. Small residential care units, they're difficult to find. They're difficult to identify as group quarters versus households and housing units. I'd like to tell people that that's the Census Bureau's responsibility. You need to identify the address. If you know that it's a group quarters, fine as an indicator for group quarters. If you're not sure, still identify the address. Then the Census Bureau can determine what type of unit and how it should be enumerated. But in either case, it's the address, the location, that you need to be able to provide. You can get into an awful lot of detail with group quarters. I'm not going to go to this site, but use this link. It will go to an ACS technical documentation that gives you group quarters definitions for different types. It's a long list. There are lots of different types of group quarters, and you should become familiar with how they're identified so that you can address them. And they aren't always so straightforward. These are two shots from the State University here in Albany. This is a residential dormitory tower, pretty easy to identify. These are new student housing quarters that are really apartments on campus. They are non-institutional, and the question is, should these be classified as a group quarters or as households? If you have individual designators for on-campus addresses, designate them as a household. Chances are that that's what they are as apartments. But if not, make sure that it is identified and the address is keyed as group quarters. That forces the Census Bureau to go in and find out what exactly is there. Nursing facilities, prisons, pretty straightforward. These are units where people are under the authorized care and supervision of some authority, generally a state or health authority, and those are the easiest ones. Except, for those of you who have been around for a long time, remember back in 2000 when the Census Bureau geographically miscoded large prison facilities. We had a number of facilities in New York, 2,000-3,000 inmate facilities that were geocoded to the wrong municipality. That creates havoc in the data process. So don't ignore these types of units. And again, some of them just simply may be hard. This one says halfway house. So maybe, chances are it is, maybe not. This one, is this an apartment or is it a community residence, a small unit residential facility? Hard to tell. That's where field research can come to play. Okay, that's enough listening to me for a little bit now. I guess we should check and see if there are questions. Otherwise, I'm going to turn it over to Dale Miller to talk about his work.
Hi, Ryan Kammer here from the city of Mesquite, Nevada. Our town, we have a lot of people that come in, live maybe 3 months out, or 9 months out of the year during the winter time. How do we handle that? Do we have to find out if they're residents of the state, or how do you have any recommendations for people that have a house in, a household, but they might live 3/4 of the time in our city?
I'll give you two answers to that. The technical answer is you don't worry about that. You worry about the address. And the address, so we've got a lot of snowbirds too, and probably some of them are retreating to your places in Nevada.
Probably.
Yeah. What you need to do is make sure that the address is captured. And it then becomes pretty much up to the Census Bureau and the individual. Keep in mind that residence is pretty much self-identification. So if that individual responds to that, is at that address at census time, and responds that is their usual place of residence, that is where they would be picked up. The flip side is if that person responds that their usual place of residence is New York, then that would be picked up as a vacant housing unit, and the people would be reconciled back to New York. So the important thing is that both addresses are somewhere in the master address file. Now, my second piece of the answer to that is very New York-centric. And when we did training, we would always try and encourage groups that knew of people who were snowbirds to remember that New York was their home. I don't care if they spend 9 months in Florida. If New York is their home, I want them counted in New York. And so, again, I'm sure the Census Bureau doesn't like to hear me say that, but it points out that it's really the self-identification of the individual. Your role in LUCA is to make sure the address is there.
Perfect. Great. Thank you.
Okay. Great. Then Dale Miller has been a colleague for, God, I don't remember how many years, but a long time. And at the planning office in Herkimer, Oneida counties, which is based in Utica, New York. And he's got some wonderful data systems available to him and a lot of experience with doing LUCA. So I'm going to turn it over to Dale.
Thanks, Bob. I appreciate it. If you want to slide to the next slide, Bob.
Yeah.
As Bob said, my name is Dale Miller, and I work for a two-county regional planning office in upstate New York, basically in the heart of the state. We have about 300,000 people that live in the two-county region, and they live in roughly 135,000 residents. I've been involved, again, with the census since 1990 and LUCA for the last two, the most recent one being 2010. The process then appears at least to be somewhat similar to what we're going through now. At that time, in 2010, we submitted some 17,000 addresses that we felt had been missed in some capacity by the Census Bureau. Eventually, about two-thirds, about 11,000, were accepted by the Census Bureau, and another 6,000 were found to be unfounded. That is to say that they were either duplicative or they had a use change or some other thing like that. And so consequently, we had to go on from there. Slide, Bob. So for me, when I go talk to the local government agencies about the LUCA process, I try to make it as simple as can be, and in essence, LUCA boils down to one thing. It's a comparison of two databases, one being the master address file that the Census Bureau has and plans to use on Census Day. The other database is whatever the locals can come up with, and in essence, that means they have to put together from whatever sources they can find a database which is then comparable to the master address file. It's really a fairly basic process. When I begin to look at those databases, the next one. When I begin to look at those databases and talk to them about the things they should consider, I try to focus on really three things. I talk to them a little bit about the availability of local data. Time is of the essence. We don't have a lot of time between now and when LUCA begins. Obviously, the time to collect and put together this address file is not when LUCA comes in February, but rather well before it. So I try to push them a little bit that they need to see what's available, and if things are going to take too much time, to don't worry about it, forget it, go on to the next thing. In addition, I think they need to make sure to consider the reliability of the data. What was the purpose of the address file that you're accessing? Why was it collected? Was it a political purpose, utility billing? All of those things may collect the information in different ways for different purposes. And then lastly, I try to make sure that they consider the accuracy of what it is they're looking at. The data is maintained by somebody, so who is that? And how often do they update it? These are the kinds of things that I want to try to emphasize to them that they consider when they're building that local address file. Okay, Bob. So for me, in our relatively small region, I tried to basically marry three databases together. I took one which is called the Street Address Maintenance Data, and that is a New York State-specific address file, and it covers the entirety of the state. I'm able to pull out those addresses that are associated with our two-county region, and then our GIS people, because they were already busy with some of this, enhanced it in some ways by making sure that the files that they gave us seemed to match, or at least we could rectify them with some of the other local data that they had geographically. The good part, obviously, of this particular database is that it comes ready-made with addresses. They're pretty standard pieces that you would expect. In addition, they did provide, through the SAM data, that street address maintenance data, some point files. So they would identify buildings and structures based on point identification. That allows a pretty easy transfer again over to our GIS unit. Now, part of the problem with that particular database was that it was measuring and identifying structures as opposed to necessarily housing units. So it would identify businesses, it would identify farms and barns and silos, as well as houses and housing units. So it was a little bit tough there to decide how it is you're going to identify which ones were units and which ones were not units, which ones are just a business and which ones, are something else. In addition, that particular data set had an issue with what I refer to as point dumping. So if you had a large parcel which had, let's say, 150 mobile home units on it, they might have taken all 150 points representing those structures and simply dropped them at the front gate. So they weren't necessarily attributed out to a specific address. Rather, they were just dropped right at the parcel where it entered the local roadway. So, again, that was something which our GIS unit worked on kind of taking care of for me. The second database, and this is one that will be available, I think probably is available in most places, is the real property tax parcel data, your local tax records. And again, because it has standardized addresses, it's a very easy thing to begin to use and to marry into other databases. And within New York State, there's a variety of property classifications that get attached to those properties, to those individual parcels. And those classifications allow things like the identification of a single family home, or perhaps a duplex or a triplex. They also identify apartment buildings as well as mobile home parks, businesses that have an apartment. So there's any number of things that through that classification was helpful. Another little piece that actually has been pretty helpful from the real property tax parcel data has been it also identifies the number of kitchen facilities within a particular structure. So if I have a single-family home that shows 4 kitchen facilities, it makes me scratch my head. And consequently, I might go and take a look on Google Earth or somewhere else if I have to do a site visit and take a look and see, are there 4 mailboxes? Maybe there's 4 gas entrances. Maybe there are 4 electrical entrances. And then I begin to understand that, in fact, this is not what it appeared to be, but rather it had multiple units within it. Part of the downside of real property tax parcel data is that there is, unfortunately, assessor coding error. Sometimes it's not so much coding error, but it's because of the nature of the coding. It's done at a point in time. Subsequent to that, that use may have changed. It may have changed drastically. It may have went from a business to now some sort of a housing unit, or it may have gone from a housing unit to a business. So it's important to recognize that those codes, those property classifications, aren't always correct. And because there is some lag time in getting that information into the books, new builds sometimes lag a little bit, and fortunately there is a process post-LUCA to identify some of that stuff. The last database that I used was the 911 telephone data that we have available locally, and I had to get it from both counties. They operate independently of one another. And I think for probably most places they have something similar to this. And so again, it's a standard kind of address format, and so it's pretty easy to access. Nice part about the 911 data was that it was historical in nature. So they had a lot of data that was from many years ago still in their files. So just because something maybe doesn't show up currently as a house, or that is to say as an apartment, it may have in the past, and who knows, if maybe it's been changed back since then. Part of the problem, of course, with accessing the 911 telephone data is that, well, with people moving to cell service so much, they have a smaller and smaller database to sort of work with. They rely heavily on getting, telephone numbers from Verizon or other telephone service providers associated with addresses. So it becomes a little bit more difficult as we move forward. In addition, in some cases, they are again attributing, they are more interested in an address versus a unit. You may have a house that now has 6 apartments in it, but they're not so concerned about whether it's apartment A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. They're more concerned about that it's at 123 Main Street. So there is some concern with that occasionally showing up. Next slide, Bob. One of the things that I really want to emphasize is when you do go out there and begin to get your data together and kind of marry those 3, in my case, together, the most important thing you can do is to build a solid foundation by standardizing these data files. Bob spent a little bit of time talking about this before, so I won't spend a lot on it, but you have to make sure that once you parse out those data records into their street, the suffix of the street, the prefix of the street, the numbering of the street, etc., you want to make sure that you go through and begin to make sure that they're all done in a similar way. So is it Ave or is it Avenue? Is it AV? As far as the numbers go, is it 110 and 110 and a half, or is it 110.5? Again, these are things that you're going to ultimately use to reconstruct that address and hopefully get them all standardized in a very similar and simple format. All right. There are 2 other real important considerations before I started moving into actually reviewing the local address files. The first rule that I had was delete nothing, sort of like doctors do no harm. I didn't want to get rid of anything until the actual LUCA review begins. Even though I can see or I know that a house has been demolished or torn down or boarded up, I would mark that record in a way that I knew that it had been demolished. But I'm not going to delete it yet because I want to match up and see whether or not it still exists in the census file, in the master address file. If it does, then I want to make sure to notify the Census Bureau that it needs to come out. There are, it's really, as much as it is about adding addresses, hopefully getting everybody counted, it's also about having an accurate database available both to the Census Bureau and to the localities. So don't delete anything, but make your necessary notes or codes to indicate that something needs to change with this particular address. In addition, what I would suggest is as you build any database file, if you're throwing together more than one database, and in my case it was 3, I think that you should try to give some ranking to the 3, establish some kind of a hierarchy among those databases. For me, the SAM database, that State Address Maintenance Database in New York, was the one that I had the most confidence in. It's the one that, in essence, after we had enhanced it some, I felt as though everything that was in there was pretty darn accurate. So once I did that, I then wanted to look at the other 2. Real Property really was my next best database as far as its accuracy, in my opinion, and then the 911 database, which was a little bit less likely to be spot on. But the point is, once I established that SAM database as being my standard, I can then start to compare the other 2 to it to see whether or not the addresses they have are in it. And if they are, then I know that, okay, that just enhances, or at least it improves my belief that the SAM data is good data. And to the degree that they're not in there, I then have to pass some judgment on, okay, well, what do I have with those, and how do I check to see whether or not they're, in fact, good addresses? Okay, Bob. So, in essence, that leads me to what was the first step I took. Once I had those databases together, once I'd standardized them, now I began to take a look at my non-SAM addresses, in essence, those addresses which weren't in my best address group. And by looking at those and using Excel to simply help identify those that weren't part or didn't have a SAM counterpart, I was able to then assess them based on whether or not they appeared in both the Real Property and 911, which to me indicated it was a fairly good address, whether it appeared in the Real Property alone, which again I thought was good, or whether it was in the 911 alone, which was a little bit more iffy. It doesn't mean that I don't believe them. It doesn't mean I don't trust them. It simply was a way for me to score them, to give them some value, so that if they don't show up on the master address file, I now know how hard to fight. So if I know that they're both in real property and 911, but yet they're not in the master address file, I think I want to take a look at those. I want to look at those more closely than I probably want to look at the ones that are only in 911. This is just a matter of being able to prioritize my time when LUCA actually happens. In addition, what I did when I had these addresses was I started to take a look at things like Google Earth. So I could go and take a look and see whether or not, one, did it even exist, did the address exist, and two, what kind of a structure was it? In addition, I did searches on things like Trulia, Zillow, Spokeo. These are all basically housing and real estate type sites that helped me identify whether or not there in fact was a housing unit there. So, and remember, even if I went and I looked at an address and I could see the house wasn't there any longer, I didn't delete it, but I simply marked it as something that needed to be considered for deletion when LUCA began. So, the second step that I then focused on was multiple units. Obviously, this is where the real bang for the buck is. Finding those hidden apartments or making sure that the apartment complexes that we have are in fact fully accounted for is incredibly important. And so I went out and identified things through the real property codes in New York. And these are just some of the typical codes that were out there that helped me identify 2-family, 3-family, businesses with apartments in them, apartment complexes, etc. So I tried to look to see those complexes, and then I tried to find modified housing units and also group quarters. And again, a lot of times I had to go out, and instead of doing actual site view, go take a drive someplace, I would use Google Earth or something similar to that, and take a look and see how many mailboxes were on the house, how many gas entrances, how many electrical entrances, looking for additional doorways and whether or not they had a mailbox next to them. So you can get a lot of legwork done by just sitting at your desk. In some ways, is what I learned. Again, when you find a place that has perhaps 4 apartments, one of the things you want to make sure you do is have at least 4 lines of data, have 4 records, or one for apartment 1, 2, 3, and then 4, because that's how the Census Bureau typically has given it to us in the past in terms of the master address file, and that's what we want to match up to. And again, if I wasn't able to confirm that this in fact was a multiple unit, I didn't delete it, I didn't change it, but I did mark it in a way that I know that this in fact wasn't what it appeared to be in the current records. The third thing that I took a look at and tried to focus on, and again, these are all issues of how much time you might have, is I tried to focus on trailer parks, particularly because we're a fairly rural area, and there are a lot of trailer parks, and a lot of them are, I don't know if they're illegal, but they're not well known or at least identified as such. And so in finding them, I tried to make sure that I didn't just count housing units, that is the number of trailers that were there, but I also identified the number of empty lots that were there. Because remember, a lot of what I see, if I'm going to Google Earth, a lot of what I see might have been taken, those pictures, that aerial photography might have occurred in 2015 or 2013 or even 2011 in some cases. So a lot can change over those, 2 to 6 years. And so consequently, if I really felt suspicious about something, I might actually drive out and take a quick look. But again, you can also track down a lot of these through Trulia, Zillow, and other sites like that. The fourth thing that I tried to focus on, and actually this is sort of where I am at the moment, is trying to identify group homes, group quarters, and in particular things like group homes, assisted living, skilled nursing care, stuff like that. Group homes in particular are becoming a bane in my life. If you look at the 2 pictures, the one on the left is the standard model, fairly new, single floor, a typical group home for adults with developmental disabilities. On the right is also a home that is for adults for developmental disabilities, located clearly just within a pretty typical neighborhood. So identifying those structures and making sure that they get identified as such is not an easy job. There are a lot of hoops apparently to jump through, and I've been jumping through quite a few of them recently. So I think that it's just important to recognize that it's not always easy to identify group quarters, and it takes a lot of digging to make sure that you get as many as you can, and it's very important for purposes of the census. So one of the things I've been trying to do is contact agencies in regard to some of those, and that has come up as being a little less fruitful than I wish it was. The last step, and this is the one that actually I'm thinking I'm going to get the most help out of, is my plan, once I've gone through, created this database, standardized it, cleaned it up a bit, done some review of my own, I plan to take the municipal level data, so for one of the local villages, for example, take all of the data that I have, which is my local census address, or my local address file. It's not the master address file, but the local file, and then share that with them and ask them to take a look at it and see what I've missed. I'm going to ask them for any changes or suggestions, things that they may know about that I don't, particularly lots of these small town villages with their main streets have a lot of hidden apartments that, as much as I might have done a reasonably good job of tracking down, they'll know more because they're local. So anyway, I'm going to provide them with copies of their data and then ask them to make changes or suggestions, whether or not they're participating in LUCA. I've encouraged them all to participate. In fact, I've gotten a couple who had initially said no to come back and say yes, that they are going to participate. But in the end, I want to give them an opportunity to look at my data. And once I've done that, I'm going to try to finalize my database for LUCA purposes. I want to make sure when I say that my found addresses equals my found units, again, if I know that there's 5 apartments at 123 Main Street, I need to have 5 entries. I need to have, apartment 1 through 5 all have their own records. And unfounded addresses, ones that I don't think are there any longer, been demolished or changed in terms of their use, I'm going to try to mark as such so that I can get them removed if needed. So, in a nutshell, sort of that's what I've done, and it's in essence something that has taken a lot of individual work, but I'm hoping that by doing it now, well in advance, I can give that out to the locals and get some information back from them, which will hopefully help us have a better count. So, I don't know, again, if there's any particular questions for any of the material. Happy to answer them if you'd like. If not, I'm sure Bob is going to be raring to go.
Okay, so let's move on. Pretty much, I guess I've covered a good portion of this, but there are a couple of points regarding security that need to be emphasized. We've, both Dale and I have talked a bit about identifying these addresses that are so difficult, that are hidden, that may be in property tax records or utility or other sources. And that information is critical in updating the map. What you have to keep in mind is you cannot go in the other direction. Part of what you agree to in the security guidelines is that the MAF data is kept secure and it cannot be used to update your records. So the classic case here might be that Census may in fact have an address for a unit that is illegal, that you do not have in your records, and you are absolutely prevented from using that information from the master address file for enforcement or updating your own records. So it's kind of the flip side here. You want to do everything you can to make sure that your addresses are in the Census Bureau's master address file, but you cannot use the master address file to then update and correct your records. And that's just another one of those absolutes. And it becomes a somewhat difficult problem because here you are, you may be going to your assessor, real property officer, and asking for data to compare to the master address file. And you have to be very clear that if there's an address in the Census Bureau's map that is not in the assessment records, that officer cannot then use that data to update their records. We've had more than one instance where that has created some problems. So be aware of that. At the end of the whole process, all of the data has to be returned to the Census Bureau or destroyed, and you have to verify that. So security is an important consideration here. You have a number of opportunities, a number of ways in which you can approach LUCA, and that has to do with the type of products that you're selecting for your review. And it's basically how do you want to get your data. You have three options. There are the address lists, and you can get address lists in digital or paper format. You can get your maps in digital or paper format, and you can use GUPS, which is that software. I'll talk briefly about each of them and show you some examples. So your address list, again, digital or paper. Digital products will require a spreadsheet or database, some software application, generally off-the-shelf type software that will handle comma-separated value text files. The data will come to you as a text file, and Excel Access, most of these products can import a CSV file with no problem. Paper is available for governments with fewer than 10,000 addresses. You can imagine, look at the next bullet, 6 addresses per page. If you have 10,000 units, you've got a heck of a lot of paper coming to you, and that's not easy to go through. But if you do want that paper product, you can specify the sort sequence. Do you want to approach the data by geographic unit, census tract, or block, or is it easier for you to approach it by street address? You can define what sort sequence you want. And this is an example of the paper address list. Notice that there are grade fields. Those are established by the Census Bureau. You aren't touching them. Every record has a line number, a master address file ID. This action code is you're going to fill this in. Is it an add? Is it a delete? Is it a correction? Get used to the coding systems that the Census Bureau uses. 2-digit state code, 3-digit county code. Leading zeros are important. 6-digit census tract codes, 4-digit block codes. This will identify the census location of each area. A flag for whether this is a group quarters unit. If so, you've got the number for the street address, the street name, and the name of the unit, in this case, which is group quarters, and a zip code. And next one is a residential area, same street, different number, but you have apartment 1 and apartment 2. So you can see you're defining these designators, what the Census Bureau is giving you, all of these individual designators. A map spot number. This is going to refer to the map sheet that you're going to find this address in, and an indicator by census whether it's a city-style address or not. This is where there was an early question about post office boxes. Post office boxes would not be city-style addresses, and so this yes in here refers only to numbered and named streets. And you have the latitude, longitude coordinates. So the action codes, as I mentioned, you're going to correct that address. You're going to delete it. The address is erroneously placed in the jurisdiction. It's an address that's non-residential. In other words, should be deleted from the census process. If you have addresses to add, you essentially have to follow a similar format. Each one's going to have a line number. You're going to have all of those geographic codes to identify it down to the block level. If it's a group quarters, you're going to flag it. You're going to do the address the same way as on the paper map listing. What's the apartment or unit number, zip code, where on the map, and this is that code for type of address. Is it a mailing address, as in a post office box? Is it the actual physical location, or does this address represent both mailing and location? When it comes to the maps, well, actually, I should go back. The digital products, if you're getting the digital product instead of paper, you're getting essentially the same information, but in a CSV format file. So all of these same fields that are listed on the paper product are going to be individual fields in the digital CSV file. In terms of the maps, again, digital or paper, digital products, you're going to require GIS software. Whatever your favorite brand is, the shapefile formats will be imported. Shapefile is initially an Esri ArcGIS format, but it's a generic import format. The digital products do not include structure points. Okay? You're not going to map it and find the point showing up on the map, but it does include the latitude, longitude coordinates, so you can plot those in your GIS system. If you're dealing with paper, you got to have an awful lot of space. At the state level, we received paper maps in 2000, and we had a whole storeroom full of, I don't know how many hundreds of boxes of paper maps. They simply are not terribly easy to work with. You have to have a lot of space. But it is available, and you can see they are pretty large format, 42 by 36 inches. So you have a number of tools that are available to you to get you started and get your preparation for receipt of the address data in February. Right now, the Census Bureau's address block count list file is available. Okay? Be clear, this is not addresses. It's a count of addresses for individual blocks. Okay? It lists every block in your jurisdiction. It gives you the count of residential housing units and the count of group quarters facilities. So it's nothing about people and units. It's just the count of units, no addresses. It's not Title 13 protected because it's only counts, not the individual addresses or locations. You also have the 2010 census unit, housing unit counts. You can go into American Fact Finder or your favorite way of pulling off summary file data and at the block level produce a listing of 2010 housing unit counts. This is what the Census Bureau actually captured in the 2010 census. And you can find both occupied and vacant. But again, we're primarily interested in just the total number of units, regardless of their occupancy. Local sources, this is the hard one, okay? So the block count list is easily accessible. The housing unit from 2010 is easily accessible. Your local sources, this is all the work that Dale went through to identify individual sources, learn about them, understand their usefulness, their reliability, and which ones pay off the biggest dividend in your approach to reviewing the actual address data. A new kid on the block, and I wish dearly that we had this in 2010, folks at Cornell have developed a system for incorporating the block count data along with the real property services data to basically target resources, identify those high-risk blocks where either census is high or local data is high, and the ones that you need to concentrate on. I'll talk about each of these in a minute. And then finally, GUPS, which should be available soon. We're kind of holding our breath waiting for the final developer version because there's some training that needs to be done on how to use the GUPS. So the address count list, again, not addresses, the count of addresses. It's developed from the master address file. Now, one of the things, remember how Dale said that he flags units that he can't necessarily find, but he has some information? The complete master address file is kind of like that. It's a historical database. it has addresses that used to exist and for one reason or another is flagged as not current. So the master address file can allow for a number of different cuts or filters to generate the address listing. But it's the Bureau's official inventory of all of the known addresses, living quarters in the country. What you are getting in this address count list is a cut of the map as of July of 2017. This was just put up in October, and the data is as of July 2017. Okay? This is what you'll use to target your review come next year. So it's updated as of July 2017. It's updated with all of the various sources that Census uses to maintain the master address file. And again, things aren't deleted, so it really depends on how the Census Bureau cuts the filters to generate that file as of July 2017. Keep in mind there are city-style and non-city style addresses. So again, rural areas, New York has a ton of them. Post office boxes, rural routes, houses that are identified by location rather than an address information. The requirements for map spot coordinates, these are necessary for non-city style addresses. But the Census Bureau does not want that post office box. Okay? They want to be able to associate the specific physical location of those non-city style type addresses. So the block count, again, number of housing units and group quarters by individual census block that are in the map. You're going to use it to compare to your housing unit counts and develop your targeting. What if you have more addresses of the Census Bureau? Well, maybe Census has missed some. If you have fewer addresses, maybe Census knows something you don't. Maybe there are geographic misallocations. What if your county and municipal totals are accurate, but then you have geographic misallocations at a block level? All of these things can be pointed out by some early processing of this data. And where you want to focus your efforts, obviously, or where the discrepancies are large. If you have to limit your efforts and target your prioritized blocks, this is where you want to focus. The links to the block count data are on the Bureau's partnership page for LUCA. The files are available for all states, counties, MCDs, and places. In New York, MCDs are towns, alphabetically by county. You go into the site and you can download the entire state file. You can download it by county. You can download it by MCD or place. It's really quite easy to access. And this is what you get, partially. This is what I downloaded as an example for one of the webinars we did in New York. Basically, what you get are the first columns here, the state code, county code, tract, and block. That's the unique identifier. If you're using GIS, you know that you need that entire fully qualified block ID to match to your GIS system. And what the file that you download is going to give you is this column that I've labeled 2017 LUCA count and group quarters count. What I've done for this example was to download the 2010 housing unit count from the census as a point of comparison. And one of the blocks that I found that I believed was intriguing and a good example was this block number 1017 in tract 13506. The LUCA count had 154 addresses. 2010 census had 125. So right off the bat, this is a pretty big discrepancy. You can see some of the other blocks are dead on. There's been no change since 2010. But this one I wanted to pursue a little further and see if I could figure out what was going on in this area. And so I pulled up the map, the reference map, and this is the block, this 1017. You can see it's actually a pretty large block, major route, street, highway here, and then residential streets that bound it. And 2017 was the one that I wanted to pay attention to. and here was the data that I compiled. And then I went to Google Maps and pulled up the same entity, and so now I start to get a picture of what's going on here. 2018, 88 units, both in the LUCA count and in 2010, and that seems to be pretty accurate. In my block, 2017, yes, there's an awful lot of established units here. You can tell kind of just by the completeness of the rooftops and the vegetation. But here's a large development area where ground has been broken and construction is going on. So right off the bat, this is a priority area to investigate and make sure that I can document that difference of, 29 units. So the block count data can be used to target this type of area. And what I did was find the development, and whenever I went to the real estate developer, found this housing development, Northridge Hollow, and in fact, all of these little red dots are units that have been sold. So whenever I go back here and I see the map, all of this area that is just ground broken, in fact, those are already units that have been sold. So I have to believe that the 125 from the census obviously has grown because of development, but 154, that's 29 units, well, it looks to me like there's a heck of a lot more than 29 units that have been built since then. So again, high priority block to look at what the actual development has occurred and what those addresses are. Geocoding of addresses, if you do not have the tract and block, local assessors, they have their own coding system, and it doesn't often refer to census tract and block. And the Census Bureau's geocoder is a source where you can do your upload individual addresses and or do batch addresses. So one address at a time you can get information from, but it gives you information about where this address is. It does not give you the census tract and block. If you do this find geographies using one address or a batch address, this is what will give you the census tract and block. This just locates it on a map. This gives you the actual coding that is necessary. So the geocoder can be good for data files, address files, where you do not already have census tract and block information. This is the type of result. I put in my address, and I get in, I'm in state New York, 36, Albany County, census tract and block. TigerWeb is another source for doing very similar type of analysis, and this is what I got out of doing my same example using TigerWeb. The map product looks very similar. The development looks very similar, but it's obviously at a different point in time because there's certainly a different level of ground clearing that has been done. The TigerWeb is another online tool if you do not have GIS capability. So there are a number of reasons why block counts can be different. The LUCA versus property tax data and SAM data could be different. Mismatch in the database, incomplete, outdated records. Some assessors are on the ball constantly updating records. Some of them aren't. Some of them have good property class information and unit information. Some of them don't. There are lots of reasons, and I'm sure all of your states have multiple situations that are similar in terms of the quality of the data. Why are block counts off? Well, geographic misallocations. Addresses were put in the wrong blocks. Addresses couldn't be geocoded. That's an important component. If you look at your address count list and you find a high number of addresses that can't be geocoded, that will flag another high-risk area. Obviously, addresses that are missing is a priority for your evaluation. And misclassified addresses are duplicate. Just because your counts are the same doesn't mean you're looking at exactly the same addresses, and you won't know that until you get your LUCA data in February, the actual address information. So again, if census and your local counts agree, probably a low priority area. If it's a high number of units, you may still have a potential for geographic misallocation. So might not be your highest priority, but don't ignore them entirely. If your local count is low, you can hope that the Census Bureau has done a good job in updating the map, but again, you're still not certain about the quality of your property tax data, and this may or may not be a high priority area. Certainly if the Census Bureau already has a higher count, then chances are that's going lower on your priority list. But where your local counts are high relative to the Census Bureau, then that becomes a real priority because you want to make sure that any address that you have, that the Census Bureau has in the master address file also. GUPS, I'll end with this because we don't know a whole lot about it yet because we don't have the actual software, but it's designed for those who do not have and do not need GIS experience. It's kind of working in a GIS, but you don't need to worry about the software or experience. It includes all of the components. So you've got the geographic network, all of your streets, tracks, blocks, and addresses associated with it. So it's all self-contained within one package. And it allows you to do what you would do in those correction and add sheets right within the software. So when you add an address, it's going to go directly into the system. There's internal validation. If you've ever gone to the Postal Service and typed in an address to get a zip code, it may come back with some options for standardizing that address. That's the internal validation that occurs so that you know whenever you enter an address that the Census Bureau can find it and it's of the proper form. No internet connection. It's self-contained, and again, this can go back to the security situation. Separate computer with GUPS is not connected to any network or the internet. It minimizes your chance for security breaches. This is what we expect the interface to look like. You will have your map information. You will have address information. The block count data that is currently available here will all be within this one-screen interface. And you can, it's got the same opportunities for action codes. The geographic codes are all the same as what you saw on that paper listing. You can go into more detail. Obviously, whenever you want to get to additional detail for an address, all of the codes that you need to respond with for adding an address, you must have the tract, you must have the block, street address, name and number, and any other additional information that can be used to help identify that address. And same thing with adding and correcting the map products. You can enter that map spot on here in the appropriate location as a way of updating right within the GUPS interface. So this really will be, especially for those medium-sized areas that have more than they want to tackle in paper but don't have sophisticated GIS capability. That's what GUPS is designed for and will be a very workable product for you. Thank you all for attending. I hope that the information was useful to you and you kind of have a better basis of what's involved in the LUCA program to encourage your counties and local governments to be involved and work on this program.